Hello and good evening to everyone, and wherever you are in the world, thank you again for joining me as we are now having another interview with two of my favorite guests, which we did in May of this year, where we look at society, we look at the way people think, way how to overcome challenges, and try and see if we can make sense of some of what has occurred in the pandemic. One of the problems that we've got is that there needs to be an acknowledgement that although the politicians were being led by some degree of science and they implemented vaccine mandates across the world, largely this was executed by the general public who embraced it lavishly. And we have to ask ourselves, why was that? What can we learn from this era of COVID discrimination? A lot of the people are still struggling with these hurts, and we need to understand how do we prevent this from occurring again. So I will add to our screen, I'll get them to introduce themselves. We have Jane and we have Christian. Who wants to go first with regards to introducing themselves? Don't all jump at once.
Ladies first.
Ladies first. Jane, go ahead. You do an
Okay, thank
introduction.
you, Philip. So I'm Jane Gunn. I'm, as you say, a retired or former lawyer. I'm now a commercial mediator. I do specialize in workplace and employment mediation, and I have in the past worked in the field of medical negligence.
Excellent. And Christian?
Hi, I'm Christian Buckland. Thank you very much, Philip, for having me back here. I'm a psychotherapist in Berkshire, got a doctorate in psychology and psychotherapy and counselling. And in addition to my clinical work, I'm the psychological advisor to UKCB Family, which is the UK's largest vaccine injury support group.
Excellent, excellent. So, yes, we're going to be taking on this topic because this is important at the moment because we have to overcome some of these challenges. And now, what I'm going to be using as the framework is this very valuable document. And so, in case anyone has never seen it, this was only published. Sorry, Christian, let me just get back. This was only published in the past couple of weeks, and I'll get it so that you can see exactly what it's about. It's the National Citizens Inquiry, Canada's response to COVID-19. It's a 600-page document, final report into the inquiry and the appropriateness and efficacy of COVID-19 response in Canada. So it was only published the 28th of November 2023. And it was done by the citizens, not by the government, because they didn't think the government would necessarily be as objective. And these were the four commissioners, the independent commissioners, and they looked at multiple aspects of the pandemic. I'm going to use this to guide some of our discussion and get some ideas about where we are. Now, Christian, you are going to be speaking as well at the UK COVID inquiry. Any thoughts as to what we are doing in the UK? Are we doing this comprehensively enough?
I think we're missing some really vital questions, like why do we lock down in the first place? Why do we throw away our pandemic preparedness plans in the first place? Those questions seem to just be brushed out altogether, and asking for things like risk assessments to everything. So there's so much that I don't think is going on. I hope to be called. I've been put forward, but it's still down to the inquiry if they will put me forward for it. But the bit that worries me is we're sometimes not asking the right question. So it's really nice to be able to look at that Canadian document because that's been done by the public. So it's going to ask questions that the public want, because what I fear at the moment is we're not asking any of the questions we're supposed to be asking.
Any thoughts on it, Jane?
Yes, I mean, both Christian and I were part of a meeting earlier this week, and the conclusion from that was that what we really need to be looking at is the record level data. You know, where's the sort of very basic data, the kind of data that's been previously compiled by the ONS, the Office of National Statistics, that shows us what you would call the raw data. That actually shows, who has been impacted by the COVID measures, and that ought to be available to members of the public so that we can ask questions about that.
hmm Yeah, so I think that I'll start with one of the basic things that seem to have come out of the inquiry, and just show you what they said here. So in this one here, in this point here, they were looking at some of the conclusions with regards to the administrative state. And so, is the state benevolent or guilty? And they pointed out here, I've just highlighted here, sadly, the majority of people succumbed to the measures out of the fear, a lack of unbiased and objective information, and questionable trust in long standing institutions. And it says, in this context, as long as most people perceive benefits from the government narrative, everything will be done to protect the illusion of the effectiveness of ill advised health measures. Is that too harsh?
I don't think it's harsh. I think it was all out of fear, but the reason why the fear was there was because of the deliberate use of psychology on the public and the manipulation of data. So there were specific tactics that the government have been using in different areas for years, and they're aware of the risk assessments of using those tactics. So they've so the public were willing victims of a psychology operation on them. So I don't think it's unfair to say that. But I like the question, are they is the government guilty of using that? Because all those psychology did a lot of different things, like negating the ability to give informed consent because they weren't given accurate information, and to give informed consent to an injection, to a vaccination. It says it's got to be free from coercion, and the definition of coercion says that it includes psychology being used on you. So I don't think it's unfair. I think it's a very accurate statement there.
Any thoughts on it, Jane?
Well, I agree with Christian. It is, people's decision making has been based around fear, and I know that one of the ways that people behave when they are in a crisis is that they deny danger, that they disbelieve what's actually going on, and then they're inclined to follow whoever's presented to them as experts. And many people would not be aware that certain techniques were being used, if you like, to persuade them to follow a particular narrative or way of behaving. And that to me is questionable. Should we not be knowing that we're being persuaded to think and behave in certain ways?
You've raised a point there, and I think we have to acknowledge this. Do you think that this kind of technique is still being used today, especially within the context of some of the international issues that we are seeing happening around us? Have they not learned the lesson? Are they just trying to keep doing this as long as they can?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they feel that it's been a successful operation. The UN have boasted that they're going to use behavioral science, which is kind of the nice way of saying these unethical psychological techniques, on lots of different areas, whether it's climate change, conflicts, gender equality, and they've been saying they want to use it as part of to progress on their mandates. So I think they actually see that what's happened with COVID is a success using behavioral science, and then they want to replicate that with all other areas. So absolutely, this is going to continue. And I do think, I've been calling for ethical frameworks to be drawn up. UNICEF have brought one up for children. I still don't think it's being adhered to, but there has to be risk assessments, because there is such long-term damage that gets used when you use psychology in an unethical manner. And to me, using it on an unknowing and a non-consenting public breaks all the rules of behavioral science. When you look at all the literature, it says you need the ongoing permission of the public to use behavioral science.
And from your own experience, Christian, are we seeing some of the impacts of that still affecting people based on your own psychotherapy work and so on? Anything that would be relevant?
Do you mean the impact of the psychology used on the public?
Well, yes, and even the impacts of the lockdowns and so on the public.
Absolutely. You know, we already had a mental health crisis in this country. Now it's on steroids. The children that were really impacted, we've got so many kids who are now school refusers. We took them out of school. They missed out on a huge chunk of socializing. So it's not just education. What you get when you're at school is socializing with peers and developing from being a child into an adolescent and then into a young adult. So when you don't have that for a while, a lot of people have really struggled with that. I've worked with many children who still want to wear a mask, and it's nothing to do with the virus or COVID. It's because they've become so used to wearing it, they feel protected by wearing it. They don't like how they look, and it's become a safety mechanism. So we've got children using safety behaviors or kind of coping strategies that are more obsessive and compulsive in nature rather than based in reality. And so we have a lot, there is so much. We've got people who still haven't returned properly to society. There are still people who are frightened and say, I feel very vulnerable, so I'm not going to go back out. There is so much damage that have been caused by the lockdowns that aren't really being understood. We kind of, just because we don't see them and they're not in the news, there are still many people who have been impacted. And again, these are the things that must be raised inside the COVID inquiry. The other thing that we've got to remember is what happened during those years. You know, people lost loved ones. There were suicides. People blamed the lockdown on as a reason for their suicide. We've got the leftover families who are dealing with that. We've got people who weren't able to attend funerals. All these things that have long-lasting psychological implications for people that a lot of those people feel we've just moved on and forgotten about it. So there are huge implications from that that to me are really important and not forgotten. And I will work really hard to ensure that people who really suffered during those years they're not silenced.
Yeah. Just taking on another point that was raised, Jane, I just wanted your thought on this one here. And so this one is more about to do with the only way out of this conundrum, they said, is through our constitutionally protected freedom of speech, wherein widely held beliefs, thoughts, and opinions are respected. And likewise, conversations, debates, and dissenting voices are heard. Should be particularly true in the scientific and medical professions. Thoughts around that?
Well, I couldn't agree more, actually, Philip. I think, as a mediator, the way we approach problem solving is through conversation and debate. We have a framework for that, which enables us to explore deeply where people's narrative, where their opinions come from, and therefore to understand that and dig a bit more deeply, and also to look at, so the mediation process, if I might summarize it very quickly, looks at the narrative and where that comes from. Then it explores much more deeply. So it goes into a deep exploration of where that narrative comes from, evidence, experience, what has people's experience been, and that kind of thing. Then it looks at solutions, at multiple solutions, not at one solution to one narrative. So we're looking at several narratives. We're looking at multiple people's experience. Then we're looking at what is the plethora of solutions, and then looking for some criteria on which you make a decision on those solutions, and then making a commitment to move forward with those solutions. So it's a very comprehensive process, but the basis of it is open dialogue and debate, non-judgmental, to look at all of those issues in one go.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And Christian, back to that point about coercion, and I thought that this was something that was really important that came out of it. And when they spoke about this in the inquiry, they said, what is surprising is how easily Canadians and their courts accepted coercive government actions in pursuit of getting every person injected with the same substance, regardless of the person's medical history or risk for serious disease from COVID-19. The hard-won principle of my body, my choice, gained by feminists after years of fighting for the rights of women to control their own bodies, vanished during the second year of the pandemic. That seems to be so true.
Absolutely. We gave up a load of our hard-earned freedoms, it felt. The principle of informed consent, my body, my choice, all those things were thrown under the bus. And, why? it was, yes, there's a lot of coercion and a lot of fear, but also the public went along with it. And I think, you know, a lot of people don't want to be reminded of actually maybe their actions or maybe what they said back in the last couple of years. But I think it's actually very important that it is analysed and we do look at what actually happened, because you know that what you put there, it was the Canadians and the courts, so it's the public and courts. And I remember, I was quickly trying to look for it, I remember seeing a video clip where, and I can't remember which government minister it was, but the quote was, "Ignore rules. If lawyers get in your way, come to us and we'll find ways of bulldozing them out of your way." And it felt that, you know, were solicitors and lawyers then kind of just told to kind of not get in the way? To where did that come from? Was that top down from the government? So it started with the government and the psychology that was used and the coercion, and then the public then were the vehicle for pushing that forward. And that started very early on. So when we're talking about the vaccines, we're actually saying this started way, way, way before, with the going outside and clapping for the NHS, which again is all about idolization. Clap for the NHS even though people are dying in their own home of any disease going, because the NHS has closed the doors to anything other than COVID, but we still say it's the best thing on this earth. There's a very, very powerful technique of getting people all in it together. So there were all these different techniques that got the public on board with coercion. Do you remember the sort of people were phoning the police to say, "I think my neighbour's been out shopping more than once," or "I think they've got too many people around their house." And this was kind of celebrated, and that was splitting society into camps and tribes, and people like to be in a tribe. They like to have an enemy. And I think very early on it was, you're the good guy if you obey all of the rules, and if you question any of the rules or you break any of the rules, you're the bad guy. And people, I think actually I was going to say on an unconscious level, but I think consciously as well, they liked that. And that is the very worrying aspect, because then that followed through, not just through on the lockdown and mask wearing. And also one other thing I remember, the chief of the Metropolitan Police saying that her hope is that shoppers will shame, or the public will shame the other members of public into compliance with wearing masks. So again, and more authority figures were telling us to discriminate, telling the public, and then the public went along with it. So it was a government approved form of discrimination, and that was small to some degree with the lockdown and masks, and then it really expanded in 2021 into the vaccine, where it's actually pushing people to take a medical procedure whether they wanted one or didn't want one. So there's a lot in that, and I feel very strongly that the discrimination was so strong, and it comes from the government, but the public, as I say, would then were they willing in it, willing to carry it forward, and forgot their ethical frameworks.
Yes, willing and enthusiastic participants would be one way of putting it. And again, now, Jane, this is now coming right into the crux of it, because it's one thing to feel upset about something, but it's completely another thing to take away someone's work and livelihood because of your perceived views. This is really a big difference. So the inquiry again dealt with this, and it showed here, it said, as they said about coercion, but they said workplace mandates caused many to accept a COVID-19 vaccine who didn't want one. People who supported their families simply couldn't afford to lose their jobs. The NCI heard from many witnesses that they or a loved one felt compelled to take the injection under the threat of losing their livelihood. This does not resemble freely given consent. Now, in the workplace environment, especially from a mediation point of view, I mean, there's nothing they can do, is there? Because this is more than just the government. This is employers. This is health and safety officers. This is the manager in the department, or everybody participating in this discrimination. What do you do?
Well, I think what probably happened is that the employers were left to make their own decision. There was no mandate on them to mandate, if you like, but they made their own decisions. So they did take, and should take, accountability. They did take their own decisions there for whatever reasons, ostensibly to show members of the public, other employees, that they were doing the right thing. All of this comes down to wanting to do the right thing. But you do get this enthusiasm for following certain rules without questioning them. And I think employers were left to take the responsibility for making those decisions themselves, and did so. And the consequences, as you have outlined. I guess the other thing I wanted to say, Philip, is that I feel there is now a society-wide, you talked about the psychological operations, but I feel those are being applied society-wide, not just from governments, but large corporations and so on, apply these techniques to us. So we as a public have got used to, even a simple example, like, people are talking about the size of the number of chocolates in a tin of Quality Street, but some of these things, things have been shrunk, and we're presented with something and we're not expected to notice that something has been changed without it being transparent. There's a lack of transparency and a lack of sharing, again, data with us. It would be more truthful to say we've actually changed the size of your bar of chocolate rather than we've shrunk it and haven't told you. But the point I'm making is that deception has become normalized. And a very interesting psychiatrist I've been following recently, Sam Vaknin, was talking recently about the difference between normalizing something. You could have almost 99% of people following something, but that may not be socially and psychologically healthy. So there's a difference between what's normal and what's healthy. And that's a clear distinction to make when we look at these kind of situations.
Yeah, and actually, what you said there was quite clear. Is that the private companies unilaterally impose mandates on workers outside of their existing labor contracts, based on a wholesale adoption of the Government of Canada's or provincial or territorial health directives. And as it says, testimony indicated that when a worker refused to take the mandated vaccines, they were either dismissed for insubordination. Many were put on extended indefinite leave without paid, and thus denied the ability to receive employment insurance benefits. One of the things that I'm raising with this is that how some people would like to walk past this and say, okay, that was behind us. I didn't really mean for you to lose your job personally, but if you didn't do it, you deserve to. What is the thinking there, Christian? What do you perceive is going on?
I think cognitive dissonance is at play. They know what they did was wrong. That is wrong. It's unethical to coerce anyone into a medical procedure. It goes against all of our ethics. It's, in the UK, the Green Book of Immunisation states these things. So, I think everyone now just wants to forget about that and say, well, we didn't know and we all did our best. But actually, there are principles in place to ensure that we never take a guess at certain things. There is a line in the sand where you do not cross those lines. And one of them is about coercion of medical procedures. So, and this where I think the fear comes into it. So out of, because of the manipulation of fear, and it was deliberately used. And, we know in the UK it was artificially inflated. The government have stated that. We know that it's artificially inflated. We've seen those reports. So because they have done that, I think it's now we want to brush past this and forget all about some of the things that we have done. But I don't think we should. We need there, number one, because people have been traumatized. People have lost their jobs. People have lost their homes. People have lost loved ones through these vaccines. And this is such an important topic that we don't just brush over it. I feel very strongly that we can't, because we'll be back in this situation again if we're not careful.
And so just to give you some examples here, and these were again in the inquiry. So this was from one person here. So she was an advanced care paramedic. She had worked for 24 years in the service. And so she was first suspended and terminated for willful misconduct for jeopardizing workplace health and safety. because she didn't take the vaccine, even though she had infection and did not require it. Now, she describes a toxic work environment within the health service, which after the vaccines became available, which extended to healthcare workers and the patients who were seeking the services. Now, what I'm highlighting here is that I don't see how you blame the government for that. That's people.
I think it's a mixture. I think that it started with the government using fear, and the behavioral scientists who recommended it will know what happens when you induce fear in a population. They will know what then happens, that it ripples out, then people do their own thing. So I think it does start there, but then there also has to be accountability for corporations, organizations. There has to be, but I think it's not mutually exclusive. I think that both are at fault here.
So, Jane, so they imagine the person coming back into that same job after, say 2 years out, as what happened in New York. How do they interact with their colleagues?
Well, I guess they'd find it very challenging. I mean, there probably would still be some stigma. There would be a sense that, they didn't play the game at the time. So it would be very challenging for them to come back. And I mean, in different circumstances, these are the kind of things that I mediate. How do people return to a working collaborative relationship when they've been divided by different opinions and narratives, and these are challenging things to do, but it's possible. I think that some hard work is needed to be able to bring those people who were alienated from their jobs or from society back in. I mean, many people have suffered schisms in their families and friendships. All three of us would recognize that. So it's not just in the workplace. Again, this is across society where we are seeing the fallout, the very significant fallout of these measures, I think.
Yeah. And so I'll ask you this thought, Christian. This is that one other person's wife was subject to a vaccine mandate, and the mandate was not imposed by government regulation, but it was adopted by the company management. They wanted to get pregnant, and so they didn't want to get vaccinated. They were worried about it. They applied for an exemption, couldn't get it. His wife was bullied and coerced from all sides of her work, including her union, which would not support her. 11 days after being terminated, she took her own life. These are heartbreaking stories. And I'm saying that this is real. This trauma is real for those individuals. You can't just move on, can you?
Absolutely. I think this is exactly why I have made a promise that I won't be silent on this, because there are people who have had such awful things happen. That story there is dreadful, is absolutely heartbreaking, and I wish that it was the only one, and it's not the only one, through coercion and all these different things that have happened. It's, there has to be some form of accountability. There has to be, because that will live with that family forever. And people that, as I said earlier, there were people who there are parents whose children took their lives during the lockdown, and they blame the lockdown as an example. So there's lots of different areas here that we can't just walk away from. I know many people just want to talk about what happened in the last 3 years. They go, yeah, but that was back then. And I'm thinking, but until there is recognition of actually what happened, what really happened to people, because these are people's real lives, that just because they're one or two and they're not, you don't hear them in the media all the time, does not mean they did not happen. And I think that's what sometimes happens, is because the media don't want to report on this very much, people don't make a big deal about it. But to me, this is huge, and this is, as I say, if we turn a blind eye to this, we will be back here again, and we'll have more unnecessary, unavoidable suicides, mental health issues, other things. So just hearing you read that one, it it does something to me. It really does.
Yeah, and Jane, I mean, as I said, when we look at where we are now, there are so many things that need to be addressed. It's almost overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard you mention that principle of the truth and reconciliation, learning the lessons from South Africa. Tell us again what you think we could do.
What I've been thinking as Christian's been talking is what this issue more than anything does is shine a light on human nature. And it's all of our responsibility then to have a look at ourselves. What do we learn? So one of the things we always try and draw out of a mediation is what are the lessons that we've learned, not only about ourselves, but about the groups and the organizations and the societies and governance itself. And I think it's all of our responsibility not to just say, well, let's move on, but to say, what did we learn from this about ourselves, about human nature? Because there are certain elements where we may think that we belong to a civilized society, but we don't. We are not civilized towards you. We're not civil towards each other in these times. And how, therefore, can we learn from that? And I think, Philip, it is about coming back to understanding what principles we want to live by, what values we want to live by. When we group together and we form groups and we form societies and organizations, and when we elect our politicians, what principles do we want to be governed by? What values do we want to be governed by? This is up to us, because we hold those organizations, those representing us in government, we should hold them to account, and we don't. We can't be bothered. And so we do have to take a hard look at ourselves as well as a civilized, or a society which ought to be civilized, and say, are we? And if we're not, can we form some kind of movement that looks towards, yes, you've mentioned the truth and reconciliation. That was an important thing to say. Let us reckon, let us acknowledge what we did here, and how do we learn from that and move on. And it's not a one-stop shop. It's a continual thing. We have this sort of, as humans, we are ego-driven. We have human nature, as we form together in groups and organizations, some of our worst characteristics come out, and we have to keep looking at that and moving beyond it. But it's not something we do once and done. We have to keep on doing that day after day.
Yeah, it's difficult issues that we have to face, and this is part of the reason why I wanted to bring it up, because I suspect I was listening to the news recently, and I was seeing that they were calling for the leadership of certain universities to be taken down because they didn't like what they said. And I'm thinking, we really don't seem as though we have learned much from the pandemic. We're doing the same kinds of things over and over again. Christian, what do you think is driving that? Because it seems to have come out so easily in the population. It's one thing to blame the leadership, but the truth is that we were ready. What is it about? How do we fix that?
I think that over the last probably 20 years, we've lost a lot of meaning and purpose in our life. And we're getting a lot more meaning and purpose through technology, through social media, through likes, through things that aren't very tangible. And so people are wanting to have a finding, they're wanting to be in tribes more, they're wanting to have an enemy quite a lot. So I think that a big thing that's happened over the last sort of probably in my time, where I really started to see it was through Brexit and the 2016 election. I really saw this complete split in the public. People started to come to therapy to talk to me about Brexit, to talk to me about Donald Trump being elected and how the whole world illusion was now shattered. And it was as if Brexit, it would just take the Brexit one as an example. Brexit for some people was the worst thing in the entire world. They couldn't go, well, there could be some good or some bad. It became black and white. And I think and that is coming out, I think, of because we've lost things like a connection to God and family. All of those things have been eroded into society, that we're then focusing on specific issues and making them being very polarized. They're either good or they're bad.
Mm-hmm.
And I think where we are now with that is exactly the same thing. We don't tolerate open debate and open dialogue. We want to shut it down. If you don't agree with me, I want you to shut up. I will cancel you. I don't want to learn from you. I want you to shut up. And that is being born out of social media. And as I say, technology, I think, this is a problem that's born out of this reliance on technology. So I think it's come from there, but it's not stopping. And we saw it with COVID, and we are seeing it with all the different areas, trying to get people to have differing views and just be civil and go, let's learn from each other. It seems to be almost impossible. And that, to me, as a psychotherapist, and Jane, the same, it must be the same with you as a mediator, is I'm going to try and sometimes hold that middle ground and allow a conversation to emerge, because that is what we're not, as a society, we're becoming very, very bad at doing.
And is there any way to train this, Jane? Yeah, you're right, Christian. People can't seem to have civil discussions anymore and differences of opinion. What is going on?
Well, the way to train it is to give people the experience of it, to enable them in some way to experience. And I do a specific exercise when I'm working with people in organizations where they have to take polar opposite views on something. And then they have to explore that by then digging deeper to express their needs, their interests, their fears, their concerns, their beliefs that underpin that. So we have a model that we work with in mediation that says, mostly we operate from our positions, from our narratives. Under that lies a whole wealth of information, which we never bother to question or explore. When you do that, you form a deeper understanding not only of yourself, but of the other. And then you also find common ground. So in that exercise, I always find that people come together. Very often they end up agreeing on some fundamental point. And so it is just giving people the experience of that. And it's possible to do that. Yes, going back into schools and teaching critical thinking. Critical thinking, we don't think critically very much these days. It's been sort of weaned out of us. I interviewed on my podcast this week somebody who works a lot with young people, and he was highlighting this need for acknowledgement and applause, and then twisting that round and saying, well, how can you enable young people to experience making an impact rather than seeking acknowledgement and applause? So there's a different way there to work with young people too.
Yeah. I wanted to ask Christian about this because I see this so often and I'm not sure what to do with it. And it comes up, this characteristic thing about sheep. I don't think it helps.
It's just entrenching everyone in their camps again. It's name calling. It's, and it's very easy because people are angry. People have been hurt. They are angry, and they're like, seriously, can you not see the wood for the trees? And so I get it. I completely and utterly understand why people use it. But if you're it depends what you're trying to do. If you're trying to reach anyone and try and change opinions, which I actually think we have to do, you can't alienate. It's when you start calling names, it's like you're raising your voice and shouting. As soon as I raise my voice, I see everyone glaze over and I've lost the argument. So it depends what someone's trying to do. Sometimes it's actually quite nice to be able to vent and just say, so that's what I think a lot of people do. They're just sheep. I think that makes someone feel better. They've got rid of some of that anger that's pent up in them because they're hurt. But if we're wanting to have constructive dialogue about opening up a conversation rather than shutting it down, we can't resort to name calling. So it depends what you're trying to get at. But I understand why people are angry. But to me, it's entrenching, and what Jane said is exactly what I really, really like. I really like saying to someone, okay, we've got really differing views. Let's go away and do our homework. I'm going to try and understand your point, like why you think it was really good to coerce me to do something I didn't want to do. And you understand what it was like to be terrified of what you're trying to make me do. And then let's come back. And it's really important because sometimes, a lot of the time, the one thing that comes up, the common ground, is I'm trying to protect something, someone, me, someone else. You know, it can be the same thing with climate change. It can be the same thing with the war, with the wars that are going on around COVID. They're always the same thing. That everyone believes they're doing something for the right reason, and it's normally out of fear. So
I was just, as you said that, Christian, I thought to myself, I suddenly realized, because I'm claustrophobic. And so if you put me in a tiny space and my only way out was to vaccinate you, yeah, okay. if that makes sense. So do people have to acknowledge that they were so afraid that this was not a logical, reasoned position?
I don't think it's as black and white as that. I think that some people were afraid, absolutely, but other people, I think, enjoyed. I do actually think some people enjoyed a position of power and saying, you're the bad guy, I'm the good guy. I do think that it played into some part of what it is to be human. There was an element of control.
Yeah. And any thoughts on that, Jane?
Well, one of the things I was going to say, Philip, is always looking at who benefits. And sometimes people benefit financially from a decision and from enforcing something, but sometimes they benefit in ways that Christian's saying, they may get some sense of power or some sense of authority or whatever. So that question, who benefits, is an interesting one. And then going back to a principle from mediation, I think from Stephen Covey, is to say, always seek first to understand. We want to shout at others and say, will you just listen, and will you do what I want you to do, and will you sort of back down? And actually, no, the question is, why do you believe what you believe? Where are you coming from? And let me understand that. But that's the hardest thing to do when you're trying terribly hard to change someone else's mind.
Yeah. And one of the points again about this, this is one of the final points that I'd selected, where unions did not support the objections of their members to mandatory vaccines. And due to the union agreements, these workers were denied the right to appeal their layoff decisions. This is pretty deep. This is all the way through an organization. So this is what I mean. This is not one or two people. This is not the CEO making up. This is all the way down to every part of almost every organization around the employment issue. That's significant.
And it's groupthink. It was just going along with everyone else. Everyone else made a decision. We're just going to go ahead with it, and it's popular. I think until slightly off topic, feels on topic and off topic, until it's acknowledged just how awful it was for many, many people who stood their ground and believed in what they believed in, until it is acknowledged just how awful they were treated, I don't think we're going to move forward.
Can we do it again, Jane?
Sorry, can we do what again, Philip?
Can we do something like that again?
Yes, I mean, the potential is there that we would do it again, I'm sure, unless we do highlight this now and learn lessons from it. And so I think there is a need to continue working to show what some of the awful experiences were, to highlight that and learn lessons from it, because unless we do learn lessons and have some kind of reconciliation, we will absolutely just repeat this again.
I didn't want to touch on this, but I couldn't miss the comment here. There's a German word, Salonfähig, and unions have been like that for decades now. But what stood out to me is that I realized that we do have to question, and the question in my mind from a historical perspective is, how did Germany heal its wounds after all those? Because it wasn't this one thing about what happened in the war of the Jews, but we're talking about people would have seen things that they thought were wrong, but they chose not to say anything about it. And so even in terms of the the link with regards to the mandates and people losing their jobs, losing their homes, losing their life, families breaking up. If you were silent, does that make you complicit or cowardly? Is there another ground to plead?
I think, as well as the German experience, the South African one is the same with apartheid, isn't it? I think, there's a similar analogy to draw there. And I don't think it's about, I don't really like this idea of being black and white and blaming people. I think there are just lessons to be learned, very harsh lessons to be learned, and we must learn those lessons. We must, as a human race, learn those lessons. Otherwise, we will certainly repeat the behaviours that we have shown both as individuals and as organisations and in government.
Any thoughts, Christian?
We will repeat this. I think that is the thing, and that's what I'm trying desperately to make sure we avoid, because we are just ignoring what happened, and people want to ignore it. There's that process. Majority of the public do not want to acknowledge what happened, and when you're talking about the people who just went along with it, and that is a big percentage, people kind of thought, I don't really get, like, just take, I don't know, the lockdown. There's a lot of people who didn't think it was a good idea but went along with it. I can understand. I understand why people went along with things. We don't want to make a fuss. We just want to get on with things. And with the discrimination, we saw it. Maybe we didn't say anything, but I think again, it's just ensuring we shine a spotlight on it, and we don't let it forget. It's a little bit like we're talking about Germany. We still talk about Germany, and it's taught in schools, and we look at the different sides. I think this must never be forgotten. So I don't know why this person sprung into my mind, but I gave a talk in Austria last year, and a woman came up to me afterwards asking if she could see me for some therapy, and I wasn't taking on patients at the time, and she said to me that it was the most traumatic experience of her entire existence, and gave me a bit of her history, which was already very difficult, but it was the system that had let her down. The authority, the healthcare systems blamed them, and I really remember feeling so hurt by this person's trauma that's going to, I know that her trauma will live with her forever, and we have to ensure that we protect people, because that is not a one-off. There are many, 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 many people all over the world who are traumatized by what has happened, and we have to do our best to avoid it. And I think part of that process then is going to be the people who kind of thought something wasn't right. I don't want to blame them, because I want them to feel empowered that if they think that something was wrong, they'll speak up. A lot of people didn't speak up for being othered and ridiculed and attacked and demonized. And by speaking up, and I've spoken up a lot, I want to ensure people are empowered that they do speak up. And we should be continuing to have conversations. You get into a taxi, have a conversation with the person about what's gone on. What was the last 3 years like for you? I want to encourage people to constantly be talking about this topic.
Yeah. Now, I want us to close in on a final bit of information, because both of you were at the recent Parliament thing with Andrew Bridgen. And one of the other issues that has to be faced, this is what we spoke about 6 months ago, is the fact that there is a lack of interest in terms of excess deaths and so on. There still seems to be this cognitive dissonance, which is blocking the ability for us to get people to focus in on what has happened and what are the potential longer term implications. The truth is, if we can't even acknowledge simple things like maybe we were too hard with regards to vaccine mandates, how in the world are they going to acknowledge that?
Yeah, it's a very difficult one, Philip. I mean, again, I go back to the sort of this desire to or request, call to action, really, to people to ask for the record level data, because when that, it is partly up to us, the public, now to be asking for that, because it exists. It's a simple, you do it through a Freedom of Information access request. And we can ask for this data to be released so that it can be examined. And we should be, because it's important that, and again, so that we learn lessons from it. What was the real impact of the decisions that were taken?
Mm-hmm. And Christian, what were your thoughts from being there?
Well, I think that excess deaths have to be investigated. You can't, if we don't look at the cause, we'll never be able to fix the problem. So the fact that, you know, we're just not looking is extreme. Like that's kind of says there's a reason why they're not looking. But one of the main reasons why the MPs aren't pushing for it is because their constituents aren't demanding it, because the majority of the public do not think there's a problem, because it's not on the news. If we had that running, I remember saying this last time, if we had a running ticker like we did for COVID with all the excess deaths every day, you'd have everyone up in arms and saying to their MP, what are you doing about all these excess deaths? So that's one of the big problems. But we do need to be requesting, you know, number one, on the excess deaths, but the second thing, absolutely the key message that now has to be driven home to MPs and to everyone is requesting the data, vaccinated versus unvaccinated, that data, in light of the data of whatever that data is that's come out of New Zealand. It's caused a lot of people to be very, very interested and say this is highlighting something very dangerous and significant. Therefore, what has to happen now is governments around the world must be starting to release the data so we can actually either be reassured or understand there is a problem and then how we're going to deal with the problem. But we can't just bury our head in the sand. It's one thing I say to my patients all the time is you can't be an ostrich and bury your head in the sand. You've got to face what's going on. And I feel at the moment we're just not facing it. And that is going to prolong all the problems and just kick the can down the road.
And it raises the question, this is what I'm saying, is that we are in a period of inertia, Jane, where it's almost as if people have been burned out. They wanted everything to be beyond it, everything would be done, everything would be solved, and it isn't. And they have no more energy. Is that what it is?
I think that's absolutely true. I feel like that myself. You know, it's been a long 3 years, and of course, you know, it's much easier, isn't it, to go back to some semblance of reality, but that doesn't help us in the long term. And I think possibly we don't have a long enough view to say, how do we want life to be in 5 years or 10 years? You know, going back to normal tomorrow and going back on holidays, it isn't actually dealing with a problem that still exists. And so I agree with Christian, it is about facing reality. And one of the other sayings we have in mediation is test all assumptions to extinction. Whatever you are assuming to be the case, test it to extinction.
Yes. And so I'd like to get your final thoughts. We'll start with Christian here. I guess I have a general idea as to where you are, but how do we move forward? What is the best way of us going forward as a society to be looking at these things, addressing them, and trying to heal from them?
I think if you know that something is wrong, then have conversations. I have conversations everywhere I can do. I talk to people about, do you know, what do you make of the excess deaths? How has the last 3 years been for you? Do you feel like we were lied to? Do you feel we were manipulated? I just ask questions. I don't try and tell anyone. And I want to encourage people to be asking more and more questions, because, you know, if I tell someone, say in the taxi, something or ask a couple of questions, and then someone else 5 minutes later gets in that taxi and asks the same question or something similar, it's going to make someone put two and two together and go, actually, that's got a point. So we need to be having more conversations. We need to be encouraging people to speak up and ensure people feel safe that they can speak up. It's good to speak up. It actually feels really good to be someone who is speaking your truth. Sitting on your truth thing, and something doesn't feel right, but I'm not going to say anything, actually doesn't feel good for the soul. To be able to speak what you feel is really, really healthy. So just want to encourage everyone, ask as many questions, and we must acknowledge the harms that have been caused by all of the different things that have been forced on us.
Wonderful. And your final thoughts, Jane?
Well, I would like to encourage some kind of forum for truth and reconciliation. I don't know what that would look like, but I think that would be a hugely empowering thing to do, that we were able to create a space and a forum where some of these conversations could be had.
Wonderful. Yes, wonderful. So, yes, thank you everyone for joining us. And I'd just like to mention that tomorrow, unusually, I don't normally have a live tomorrow, but I've had a pre-recorded interview with a doctor from New Zealand who will be talking about some of the issues that we have had coming out of New Zealand with regards to the data, his perspective, what had happened to him for taking a stance. A really fascinating interview. So if you are interested, please join us again tomorrow while we go through that and learn from different parts of the world the lessons that we all have to go through. So thank you very much again. As usual, a wonderful discussion, lovely thoughts, deep insights, and just stay with me while we do the outro. And thank you everyone who's been with us. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.